Hello, everyone. My name is Tom McCullough, and I'm the assistant archivist here at the Moravian Archives. I know many of you. Great to see you here. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's panel presentation centered on Moravians and place, and to introduce you to our speakers. Thank you for joining us online and here in person at the Moravian Archives in Bethlehem. Tonight's program will consist of 3 presentations with questions and answers to follow after all 3 presentations are concluded. So we'll get through all 3 before questions and answers. If you are joining us online, please be sure to use the chat feature to pose questions to our presenters. This lecture will be recorded, so if you're unable to stay for the duration today, don't worry. In a given amount of time, not making any promises, this recording will be available in a few weeks probably. That was not a promise. Rest assured you'll be able to watch it at a later date. After Q&A, we'll have a short reception with light refreshments to follow. Ever since the rebirth of the Moravian Church in Herrnhut, Germany, under the leadership of Count Zinzendorf, Moravians have had an intimate relationship to the various locations they have occupied. Moravians have shaped and been shaped by the different localities where they built congregational towns and conducted missions to indigenous peoples. In many cases, they believed that Jesus Christ, acting through the lot, had selected locations for them to settle. Their settlements and missions were more than mere geographic locations. They were spiritual landscapes. Today's presentations will focus on 3 aspects of the Moravian creation of space, of sacred places in the 18th century. Through these presentations, we gain a deeper appreciation of how Moravian religion was shaped and, in turn, shaped the places they lived. Together, these presentations will invite us to consider the profound ways in which religion and place remain inseparably linked. Without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Katherine Faull. Dr. Faull has serves as both the Vice President of the Institute of Moravian History and World Heritage and as Site Manager of the Bethlehem World Heritage Site. Having come to Bethlehem last year from Bucknell University in Lewisburg, PA, Katie is a distinguished scholar with over 3 decades of research and teaching experience and is considered a leading global authority on Moravian history, theology, and cultural heritage. This afternoon, Katie's presentation is titled Sacred Confluence, Place, Religion, and Cultural Exchange at the Moravian Mission of Shamokin, 1742 to 1755. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Katherine Faull.
Okay, so I, of course, came into this and messed everything up because I have interactive visualizations that I have made of this book. And I'll explain a little bit about what those are, and hopefully this will work. For those of you who are at home, or even those of you who are here in the audience and who would like to access these interactive visualizations, this QR code should take you to this slide presentation. And as I go through, I'm not convinced at the technology. I should be convinced by now. Of course, the technology will be wonderful, but I'm hoping that then I can click on the slide and it will take us to the interactive visualization. Without that, I'm going to stand here going like a stranded fish, because a lot of what I want to say has to do with that visualization. I also would like to point out that there is also, on my blog post, and which is on my blog site, which is katiefaull.com, you will find both the longer text of this talk, the slideshow, and also a blog post on the methodology that I used to create these visualizations from the philological work that I did when I was working on this book, on the Shamokin diaries. So that's a really long introduction, and I know I have to be careful not to overgo my time. So I will start. In 1747, the Moravian missionary Johannes Hagen described the Susquehanna River as looking no different than a town full of houses. The rocks lie in the water, and the water flows crisscross between them like a warp and weft. 5 years earlier, Nicholas von Zinzendorf had found this same river, the Susquehanna, beautifully transparent, but also treacherous, full of smooth rocks, requiring him to keep a tight rein on his horse. These two European Moravians saw the same river, but where one saw a textile, ordered and purposeful, the other saw beauty threaded with danger. I want to suggest that this difference was not incidental. It goes to the very heart of what I am calling the sacred confluence, the way that landscape for the Moravians at Shamokin was not a backdrop to the mission, but rather its very substance. And 3 questions, I hope, will guide us in this investigation. Did landscape shape the choice of mission beyond utility and strategic advantage? Did landscape itself hold sacred value? And if so, how did the Moravian concepts of sacred place differ from indigenous ones? How do I go to the next slide? There we go. Hooray! All right, hold on. First hurdle. So as a philologist, I work with words. As a digital humanist, I use language as data to recognize patterns and to visualize them. As a translator, I know that translation is the most intimate act of reading. So when I transcribed and translated the Shamokin mission diaries, I was struck by how consistently the diarists described the landscape itself, the confluence, the islands, the bluffs, the riffles, the riparian buffers. This was not an incidental description. It was definitely an argument. So my method combines 2 tools: placeography, which maps not just where things happened, but how those places were felt, contested, and sanctified, and personography of emotions, which traces the emotional lexicon associated with specific people and places over time. Together, they allow us to reconstruct what I am calling the emotional geography of the mission. And you will see both at work in the visualizations that follow. Zinzendorf's 1742 Heidenkollegia placed Shamokin 3rd on his list, after Bethlehem and the Haudenosaunee heartland. He understood the forks of the Susquehanna River as a strategic touchpoint with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, a place where the gospel might reach multiple indigenous nations gathered together or passing through. But strategy is not the same as sacredness. What I want to trace is how a place chosen by the lot, as Tom pointed out, for strategic reasons became sacred through dwelling, through relationship, and through loss. Shamokin sat at the convergence of the north and west branches of the Susquehanna River, a geopolitical and spiritual nexus long before the Moravians arrived. It was a hub of indigenous mobility. Tuscarora, Onondaga, Cayuga, Oneidas, Mohawks, Nanticokes, and Lenape peoples were constantly arriving, departing, hunting, and passing through there. The Moravians arrived under indigenous authority. Shikellamy, the Oneida overseer at Shamokin, was not a figure that they managed. Rather, he was the authority under whom they must operate. Their mission strategy was accordingly one of strategically practiced humility, work rather than worship as primary witness, cultural adaptation rather than transformation. Where John Bartram in 1743 saw ideal land for European settlement and considered the indigenous people unable to cultivate it, the Moravians understood indigenous non-cultivation as a deliberate resistance to colonial encroachment. And that difference in reading the landscape itself is a form of sacred attention. 2 little bits of paper here. Okay, so for those of you who are at home, you can click on the emotion wheel and it should take you to a link. For those of you here, same if you're on your phones, I just want to explain that this is an emotion wheel after the model of Plutchik, a psychologist, who created this very interesting way of representing intensity and variety of emotion. So the colors mean something, the intensity of colors means something, the position on the wheel also means something as well. So I'm going to try to make this happen. It may work, it may not. Okay, so here you see we have the emotion wheel. Here are all of the years that the mission was in operation, and try and take a mental snapshot of what that looks like. If I move to the crisis year of 1755, you can see how things change. You'll see an increase in frustration, irritation, of fear, of anxiety. Go back to the early period, you can see, again, you have the very marked difference in terms of being content, pleased, joyful, and happy. And then if I go back here to all years, this is sort of a conglomeration of all of those. So this is the emotional range of the Shamokin diaries that is mapped onto Plutchek's model. What you see across the full period is a remarkable breadth of emotion: joy, trust, anticipation, alongside fear, disgust, and anger. So as you saw, when we moved to 1755, we see that the warm registers contract sharply, and what remains is fear, moral injury, and what I am calling firm boundaries, the emotional register of people who have run out of room to maneuver. Visualizing emotions like this is, in and of itself, an argument. The emotional world of the mission does not simply erode or disappear, it is ruptured. And now I need to go back to this and pray that it works. Oh my goodness. Okay. So 3 figures anchor the emotional narrative of the Shamokin diaries. Shikellamy, who is a daily companion, friend, and protector from 1745 until his death in 1748. After his death, the emotional intimacy in the diaries notably declines. His sons inherit his political role, but not his personal one. Schafmann is characterized by consistent devotion throughout the diaries. He becomes the crucial stabilizing figure in the crisis of 1755. Konrad Weiser, seemingly always friendly, always politically complicated, bridging colonial governance and spiritual mission in ways that made the Moravians perpetually uneasy. And it is my argument that people, like places, carry emotional weight in the Shamokin diary, and that weight shifts. So this is a diagram of the emotions associated with the blacksmith's shop. I don't know if I'm pushing my luck to try this again. This is also an interactive visualization. So you can see, I think, let me see, yeah, if I make it a little smaller, you can see that we have people like Shikellamy, we have Brother Weser, who is one of the Moravian blacksmiths, we have the smithy itself represented, and we have different indigenous nations, different people, different objects that they are fixing. So again, this changes. If we go to the early period and we go to trauma and violence, there's nothing. If we go to the crisis year, we can see there is definitely. The smithy is a place which is associated with emotions of violence and trauma. In the early period, if we look for sociability and companionship, we can see that we have here the smithy and the emotions that are associated: companionship, industry, friendship, and then the people, Shikellamy, and the different indigenous nations. And then if we move to the final period, an absence completely of social and companionship relations. The smithy was the economic and relational heart of the mission, and eventually its site of deepest moral crisis. Built with Shikellami's authorization in 1747, it operated on indigenous economic terms. Priority service was given to indigenous peoples, payment was made in hides and pelts, and no debt relationships were permitted. As I showed you in the early years, the forge was a place of companionship. But by the time we moved to 1755 and the outbreak of hostilities in the French and Indian War, the picture is entirely different. Brother Weser is forced to repair the blood-stained weapons of the warriors returning from raids. A place that had been a space of Shikellami's friendship and companionship had been turned into a site of trauma. The river is another such place that is associated with people and emotions. If the smithy is a site of ethical crisis, the river becomes its counterpart. The Susquehanna acts independently of human will. It floods, it freezes, it flows, and the missionaries respond to it, but cannot control it. And crucially, they also do not have to carry moral responsibility for what it does. Upriver lies the indigenous communities of Wyoming, Paxinas, Onondaga eventually. Downriver lies Bethlehem, colonial powers escape. The river does not solve colonial tension, it embodies it. It connects to both worlds simultaneously and also provides a theodicy, an escape route from the forger's impossible choices. This is also an interactive visualization, but I don't want to take up everyone's time. Again, you can access this by just clicking on the image. This is a network of all of the places, all of the people, all of the emotions, all of the both negative and positive and neutral. You can see at the bottom there's a key. Again, this is an interactive visualization, but in the to respect time, I will let you play with this. This combined visualization shows the full emotional geography of the mission. Bethlehem sits at the very center. It is always positive. It is, as we know, what the diarists call das Kripplein, the manger. It is a place that they long to be, and they also belong to. Shikellamy connects Shamokin and connects to Shamokin with dense and warm ties of friendship and emotion. But after his death, the network thins out and cools around the Shamokin node, this node here. So again, if you're looking online, you can use these filters to see how this network changes over time. And the smithy, sitting between the brothers and the indigenous people, increasingly carries emotional weight of this whole encounter. The Penns Creek Massacre of October 1755 was not the beginning of this rupture. It was, in many ways, a culmination of forces that had been building. The missionaries had been living inside the slow collapse of the mission for quite some years. They ignored advice to flee from the Susquehanna confluence. They saw how land claims were being threatened, some of them by Conrad Weiser, and plans were being made to abandon the forge and actually to move it to the Wyoming Valley. The diary entries of 1755 document a community maintaining its liturgical discipline under increasing pressure. Rösler records a Christmas love feast observed while violence mounted outside. He records a Sabbath strictly kept. The forge is closed, even as work is being demanded by indigenous people. He records a brawl being silenced by the missionaries singing, and the ritual practices of both cultures continue. But what changes is a relational fabric that made that practice possible. Before 1755, Shamokin was a place of engagement. The smithy was, as I said, a confident, friendly place. Shikellami's sons were there, but were not very much agents. And there were indigenous peoples who came to seek spiritual conversation. But by 1755, Shamokin has become uncomfortable and murderous. The indigenous people have left, and George Delaware arrives from upriver. He is protective, but he comes with a warning and not a welcome. This chart shows two divergent emotional trajectories across the mission period. The forge declines, as you can see, in terms of its emotional impact, if you like, positive emotional impact, and the river resolves. And I want to argue that this divergence is not only emotional, it is also theological. The forge demands an ethical position of the Moravians. Every decision that they make, whose gun to repair, when to refuse to do work, whether to work on the Sabbath. And each Moravian is required to make a moral choice. There is no neutral ground. The forge has made them complicit in colonial violence, whether they choose to act or refuse to act. But the river offers something that the forge could not, a theodicy. When the river floods, the missionaries write of Noah's Ark. When they nearly drown at the falls, they write of God's deliverance. Natural danger is without any kind of human moral culpability. God acts through the landscape so that suffering can be explained rather than chosen. And this is, I think, the deepest thing that the Shamokin diaries reveal about Moravian sacred geography. When ethical complicity becomes unbearable in one place, they seek out theological resolution in another. The forge and the river were not simply spaces, but rather two ways of being in the world under impossible pressure. One brief but necessary comparison. I have spoken in this space years ago on this map. This is Friedenshütten, huts of peace, established on the north branch of the Susquehanna in 1768 under the Muncie convert Johannes Papenhunk. It was everything that Shamokin never became. It was a thriving mission town. It had glass windows in the meeting house, abundant harvests, 47 communion participants at least, admired by colonial officials and indigenous leaders alike. But it also could not survive. They were forced to abandon everything on May 3rd, 1772. Friedenshütten revealed a truth that Shamokin had already intimated at. Where Shamokin had struggled against chaos, Friedenshütten achieved everything they envisioned, but still could not survive because of colonial policies. So the lesson is not about mission strategy, it is also about those who have power to determine whose sacred places were allowed to endure. So let me return to the three questions I began with. Did landscape shape the choice of mission beyond utility? Yes, but the sacred was not there at the start. Shamokin was chosen strategically, Shikellami's invitation, the Six Nations Council site, the Spithi opportunity. And 8 years of living there transformed it. The missionaries noticed the river's beauty. They tended to Brother Hagen's grave there in their pre-dawn Easter services. They called their new house there a dear little place. They left not without a little tear. Landscape accumulated sacredness through relationship and not through geography. Did landscapes hold sacred value for the Moravians? Yes, but of different kinds. Bethlehem, as I said, was permanently sacred, always positive. Letters from there acted like honey and balsam. The river, a theodical sacred, where God acted through natural danger without human moral culpability. And Shamokin was a relational sacred space, held in Shikellami's daily protection and in the unspeakable proximity of communion, and gone when relationships fractured in 1755. How did this differ from indigenous concepts of landscape? An indigenous person will tell you that they are their environment. Both groups navigated the tension between place and nobility more fluidly than simple binaries suggest. The Nanticoke rebury their departed bones. The river islands host council fires. The land, forest, and water are sites of hunt, trade, and identity. And indigenous people exercised agency. It was they who decided who could come and leave Shamokin. The critical difference is this. The Moravians could leave because Bethlehem remained secure. Indigenous people maintained sacred obligations through displacement because colonial violence destroyed their sacred places. Colonial violence, not theology or culture, determined who kept their sacred places. The Moravians could flee back here to Bethlehem. Indigenous people were constantly displaced. And both groups' relationship to landscape was relational, adaptive, and vulnerable, but only one group had a secure sacred center to return to. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie, for the awesome presentation. We'll have questions for Katie at the end, I'm sure. Our second speaker is Dr. Paul Peucker, who also, like Katie, requires no introduction, but let me do so anyway. From 1996 to 2004, Paul was archivist of the Unity Archives in Herrnhut, Germany, and since 2004 has served as archivist and director here at the Moravian Archives in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He is the founding editor of the Journal of Moravian History, many copies here, and has written several books about 18th century Moravian history, most recently being Herrnhut, the Formation of a Moravian Community, 1722 to 1732, in English and German editions. This afternoon, Paul will talk about the mythical attraction and the town of Herrnhaag. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Peucker.
Thank you, Tom, for introducing me and for solving the technical issues. Thanking Jonathan. I hope that everybody's back. I think we got interrupted online for a little bit. So I would like to talk about the mythical attraction of Herrnhaag, a Moravian community in Germany. This pencil sketch was made in 1848. It shows two buildings in Herrnhaag, Germany, 50 kilometers northwest of Frankfurt. On the left, we see the Sisters' House. On the right, the Grafenhaus, Zinzendorf's residence, also called the Lichtenburg or Castle of Lights. The sketch is detailed. It shows the details of the windows and doors, roof, and indicates the colors of the materials. So the sketch was most likely intended to be executed in more detail in watercolor or oil at a later date. The artist was John Christian Jacobson, an American from Nazareth, where he served as pastor of the local Moravian congregation and as inspector of the boarding school for boys, or Nazareth Hall. Jacobson had traveled to Germany that year to attend the General Synod of the Moravian Church, held from the end of May to the beginning of September in Herrnhut. The sketch is part of a larger series. Jacobson documented Herrnhaag from different angles and made drawings of the surroundings. When Jacobson visited Herrnhaag, no Moravian was living there. In fact, Herrnhaag had been closed and abandoned as a Moravian congregation for almost a century. So why did this American clergyman go out of his way to visit this town and to document what he saw in such a careful way? And not only did he make these sketches, he held on to them throughout his life. After he died, the sketchbook was preserved until eventually it was placed in the Moravian archives in 2002. In this paper, I would like to argue that Jacobson visited this long-abandoned Moravian town because it exercised a mythical attraction on him, and not only on him. Herrnhaag has continued to attract Moravians for more than 2.5 centuries. The story of Herrnhaag is a story of a paradise found and a paradise lost. The founding of Herrnhaag is connected to Zinzendorf's exile from Saxony. Zinzendorf was the nobleman who founded Herrnhut, a radical pietist community on his estate in 1722, consisting of Protestant refugees from Moravia and idealist believers from all over Europe. In 1736, while returning from a journey to the Netherlands, Zinzendorf learned that the Elector of Saxony had banished him from Saxony. Instead of returning to Herrnhut, Zinzendorf, his family and closest assistants chose a new domicile in the Wetterau, a region north of Frankfurt. Initially, the Zinzendorfs moved into the Ronneburg, the castle that you see here, a medieval hilltop castle. 2 years later, in 1738, Moravians began to construct the town of Herrnhaag 5 kilometers from the Ronneburg castle. The choice of the location for the town of Herrnhaag was not coincidental. While the Zinzendorfs were living at Ronneburg, their 3-year-old son, Christian Ludwig, died. He was buried in the graveyard of the nearby Lutheran parish church, the Church on the Haag. The Moravian town of Herrnhaag was founded close to the grave of the little boy. Later, his remains were transferred to the Moravian God's Acre at Herrnhaag. Thus, already from its founding, the ground where Herrnhaag was built had a special meaning. Although both communities were centered around a square, the appearance of Herrnhaag differed from that of the earlier settlement of Herrnhut. While Herrnhut at that time consisted mainly of smaller houses for individual families, Herrnhaag was characterized by large communal structures. Within 9 years, a total of 17 buildings was constructed in Herrnhaag, providing living space to circa 1,000 residents. In addition, there were worship spaces, workshops, gardens, and a cemetery. Life in Herrnhaag was exceptional in many aspects. All residents were members of the Moravian Church. Many had to go through long vetting processes before they were accepted as full members and allowed to live there. Every activity, be it worship, work, or leisure, was marked by religion and community. Many residents lived in one of the communal buildings, where each day began with morning devotions, where meals were eaten in the joint dining hall, and evening devotions were held at the conclusion of the day, before people retired to their beds in common dormitories. Special music was performed at the many festive services. The fountain in the central square played hymn tunes on each hour. On special occasions, the buildings were decorated with stars, images, religious symbols, and with lights. The illuminations of the main building of Herrnhaag were so notorious that this building became known as the Castle of Lights, Lichtenburg, until this day. Life in Herrnhaag was different than life in any of the surrounding towns. Perhaps it can be best compared to life in a monastery, but without surrounding exterior walls and the lifelong monastic vows, and with families and the presence of people of different genders and of all age groups. Life in Herrnhaag was festive, baroque, and otherworldly. Life in Herrnhaag was a foretaste of heaven. But no heavenly experience on earth lasts forever. When in 1749 the Count of Büdingen died, his son demanded unrestricted loyalty from the Moravians. The text of the oath of allegiance to the new count included the requirement to renounce any allegiance to Zinzendorf and to abandon the practice of their peculiar religious customs and teachings. The Moravians refused, took their possessions, and left Herrnhaag. At the same time, the authorities in Büdingen turned against the Moravians. At the same time, the authorities in Büdingen turned against the Moravians. An internal crisis had developed among the Moravians themselves. In their enthusiasm, many people in Herrnhaag believed the line between heaven and earth had disappeared, and they had begun to engage in activities without moral restraint. Even though the extravagances were quickly suppressed, the experience caused great embarrassment among Moravians. They realized they were far from infallible themselves. They called this period the time of sifting, during which their faith had been put to the test. So, when news came about a possible eviction from Herrnhaag, many were willing to take this expulsion as a punishment from God and accepted the ordeal. Within 3 years, Herrnhaag was empty. The Moravians had left their heaven on earth. From then on, Herrnhaag was a place of longing, a paradise lost. At first, Moravians did not abandon hope to return to Herrnhaag. Especially after Zinzendorf's death in 1760, there were signals that the authorities in Büdingen were open to have Herrnhaag reoccupied by the Moravians. However, the General Synod of 1769 decided to sell several unused Moravian buildings, including Lindsay House in London and Herrnhaag. In 1757, 7 years after the decision to abandon Herrnhaag was made, and 4 years after the last Moravian had left, the Moravian Church published a series of engravings of Moravian places in Europe, North America, and overseas, visualizing the expansion of their movement within the previous decades. And even though Herrnhaag at that time was no longer in use, a view of this community was included. In the various Moravian archives, there is a large number of similar views: watercolors, oil paintings, and pen drawings. These images, in my opinion, were not created while Herrnhaag was still an active congregation, but during later years, after Herrnhaag was abandoned. These images were mementos. They were visual reminders of a life lost. Not only was Herrnhaag recreated in the form of images on paper, there were even attempts to reconstruct its buildings elsewhere. In 1753, Zinzendorf indicated his intention to return to Pennsylvania and asked the Moravians in America to construct a suitable residence for him. Initially, Moravian leaders considered a location on the south side of the Lehigh River, overlooking the Bethlehem settlement from a small distance. By 1755, plans had changed. No longer was Zinzendorf's residence to be erected in Bethlehem, but in Nazareth, 10 miles to the north. Interestingly, measured drawings of the Grafenhaus, the Count's house in Herrnhaag, were sent over to serve as a model for the builders in Nazareth. And this is at the Moravian Historical Society in Nazareth. Nazareth Hall, as the structure was soon to be called, was not a replica of the Grafenhaus in Herrnhaag, but there are obvious similarities. However, when Nazareth Hall was finished, to the great disappointment of American Moravians, Zinzendorf sent notice that he had changed his mind and was no longer planning to move to Pennsylvania. But we still have Nazareth Hall. Moravians never forgot about Herrnhaag. We already heard about John Christian Jacobson, the Moravian minister from Nazareth who traveled there in 1848. He was by far not the only Moravian who journeyed to the former Moravian town. In 1870, Adolf Müller, a Moravian teacher from Neuwied, visited Herrnhaag. He wrote an extensive account of his journey that was published in a Moravian weekly newspaper. The fact that his travel account was published is an indication of the continued interest in Herrnhaag. Müller's account includes detailed information about his motivation and gives us an idea of how Herrnhaag was still able to exert an attraction to Moravians 120 years after it closed. He writes, "It is only a small part of the world, and yet what powerful, eternally memorable piece of history of the kingdom of God has taken place here." End of quote. He acknowledges that not everything was perfect, that had happened here, but overall, he considers Herrnhaag the stage of where extraordinary things happened. Quote, peculiar feelings went through us when we saw the old walls in the distance. We were now setting foot in the territory that more than 100 years ago was bustling with such powerful Moravian activity. Yes, this was the scene of the sad aberrations of the sifting time, but also of the greatest and most miraculous blessings from God. End of quote. For Müller, this was not an ordinary visit to a historic site, but rather a profound spiritual experience. Müller's heart was overcome with emotion and inner peace. Quote, and still, despite all wistfulness that we felt standing in the square of Herrnhaag, a feeling of peace came over us. End of quote. At the conclusion of his visit, standing in the overgrown cemetery that was hardly recognizable as such, Müller, together with 3 other Moravian men who happened to be visiting the same day, sang hymn verses together. In Müller's account, Herrnhaag is a place of pilgrimage, offering spiritual comfort, and he invited others to make the same journey. When Müller visited in 1870, only 4 of the original 17 buildings remained. He is vague about the use of these buildings. He mentions wool and yarn production, a cobbler who was no longer there, and many agricultural tools. Earlier, the buildings were used by the Inspirationalists, followers of John Friedrich Rock, before they immigrated to Amana, Iowa. During the 20th century, the buildings were used for various purposes, as a labor camp and an internment camp by the Nazis, and for refugees after the end of World War II. After the refugees had left and the buildings were once again empty, we see a return of Moravian activity in Herrnhaag. This was not an official endeavor of the Moravian Church, but the private initiative of members of the Moravian Church. In 1959, the Verein der Freunde des Herrnhaag, a Friends Association, was founded in the Moravian community of Neuwied on the Rhine River. Goal of the Friends Association was to purchase the square, the sister's house, and the count's house, and to use them for, quote, religious, social, and charitable purposes. The association has been successful and was able to purchase this part of Herrnhaag. The 2 other buildings, one of which is the former Brethren's house, are in private hands. Different ideas were developed. This is a proposal to build a nursing home in Herrnhaag. From the 1960s on, Herrnhaag had particular attraction for young people. Youth camps were organized to fix up the buildings. Youth conferences, weddings, and, in more recent years, wedding anniversaries were held here. The spaces are also used for cultural events, such as concerts and exhibits. The Sisters' House has been completely renovated and is now the home of a society, a fellowship of people who form an intentional community. The original Brethren's house burned during the 19th century, and in recent years it has been restored and now has an 18th century appearance again. So this is a few years ago, and this is what it looks like now with this 18th century looking roof. The fascination of Herrnhaag continues to hold people in its grip for different reasons. What is this fascination? For me, it is a place where history seems tangible because the buildings have been stabilized, but they've not been made look fresh or new. It gives one the impression you are looking at the same surfaces, touching the same hardware and walking on the same cobblestones as the Moravians did who left in 1750. This might also be true for others with a historical interest. For many, Herrnhaag might simply be an escape from their daily life without the demands of work, family, and neighbors. For 275 years, Herrnhaag has been a memory space, a lieu de mémoire. French historian Pierre Nora defines a lieu de mémoire as an entity, whether material or non-material, that has become a symbolic element of the memorial heritage of a community. Memory, Nora says, is different than history. History is based on scholarly research, while memory is based on what people remember or what people tell each other. As a place of memory, the memory of Herrnhaag is vague and can be filled with various content. Herrnhaag can be a place of an idealized past that does not bear the realities of the present. For some, Herrnhaag can be characterized as a Protestant pilgrimage. It continues to allow people back into a paradisal place from where humans once were expelled. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That was an excellent presentation. Our final speaker tonight, or this afternoon, is Joshua Follweiler. Many in attendance will already know Josh from his time as a student across the street at Moravian Theological Seminary, and also as a pastor at Calvary Moravian Church in Allentown, Central Moravian Church here in Bethlehem. He is currently a PhD student in the Department of History and Ecumenics at Princeton Theological Seminary, specializing in American religion. His work examines the relationship between American Christianity, economics, and the emerging Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. As a lifelong Moravian, Josh is also broadly interested in the Reformation and transatlantic German pietism. Josh holds degrees from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and, as I said, Moravian University and Theological Seminary. Today, Josh will talk about Moravian urban planning as spiritual practice. Please join me in welcoming Josh.
Thank you so much, Tom, for saying too much nice things about me. And thank you, Paul, for inviting me back to be here. It's so nice to see friendly faces again. So this paper begins, as many good historical narratives do, with a story. Living in Bethlehem, I inevitably heard about the uniqueness of Moravian spirituality in the design of the town. Concerned about outsiders, Moravian placed their inns on the extreme periphery of the community. Lehigh University, built as a technical college to support the operations of Bethlehem Steel, was placed in South Bethlehem to avoid contaminating the religious atmosphere of the Moravians who lived on the north side of the Lehigh River. To hear these stories, one would assume that spiritual considerations trumped all other concerns. Looking at various maps and drawings of Moravian towns and buildings, it is undeniable that spiritual ideals played an immense role in their organization. Yet, these spiritual ideals were always mediated by the practical and ever-changing real-world realities Moravians encountered. When looking at the development and planning of Moravian communities, we should take care to foreground the integration of smaller homes and structures alongside large iconic buildings such as churches and community housing. The tension between spiritual ideals and their practical application is best viewed across a broad cross-section of Moravian communities, especially including smaller rural communities. Examining these communities also challenges the secular-sacred dichotomy that frequently plagues scholars in urban planning and religious studies. Moravian communities can be read as theological blueprints made spatial, as long as we do not obscure how their planning was shaped by contingency, danger, growth, labor needs, and ecumenical opportunity. Moravian planning reveals a patterned flexibility rather than a rigid idealism, and an approach that balanced Christian spirituality with pragmatic realism. So to understand Moravian planning, one must first understand Moravian polity, governance. The Moravian Church was a worldwide unity whose central authority rested in Herrnhut. This didn't necessarily imply top-down mandates, but it did mean that any plan for community development or construction was sent to Bethlehem and, if necessary, to Herrnhut for approval. Gottlieb Reuter and George Glosowski are two Moravian surveyors who are most responsible for the plans and surveys of American Moravian communities. Glosowski was a Polish-born Moravian sent to America by the Unity Elders to work as a land survey. Glosowski completed surveys and plans for Moravian and non-Moravian communities. His work primarily focused on the land between Bethlehem and Nazareth, but also includes the Moravian communities of Lebanon and Emmaus. Little is known about Glosowski's early life, but Philip Christian Gottlieb Reuter's life is well known. Reuter was born in Germany, and after his studies, he became a royal surveyor. He was originally a member of a Lutheran church, but joined the Moravian church at the age of 21. Reuter was sent to America in 1756 and worked 2 years in the northern province before heading south to survey, map, and plan the further development of the Waco tract, which is now Winston-Salem. Glosowski and Reuter were routinely accompanied by a bishop of the church who would hold discussions with local Moravians and offer valuable input. The plans and reports generated by Glosowski, Reuter, and the bishops were sent to the Elders Conference for approval. The process of planning approval ensured that while each town was unique, there was some consistency in design, aesthetic, scale, and placement. And this is long before the term form factor entered the vernacular of town planning. Moravian instituted the ideals of form factor by prioritizing physical shape, placement, and relationships of buildings to the street and creating a sustainable and character-rich religious community. Building material may have varied slightly due to local availability and layout determined by topography and existing structures. Moravian communities established in the 18th century show how governance and theology translated into the built environment, producing towns that balanced local adaptation with transatlantic ideals of order, discipline, and communal living. Controlling, among other things, building heights, setbacks, and street integration created a community where buildings fit together in a coherent manner that produced social, economic, and for the Moravians, religious flourishing. So we can start with Graceham. And perhaps surprising to some scholars is that these towns were often implemented only after a community had started to form. In what would become a pattern, Moravian communities often began by meeting an immediate need. For the outlying settlement congregations, the desire to have a pastor was the most frequent need. Flush with ministers and eager to spread the gospel, Moravian leadership routinely sent pastors to churches of other denominations who had unfilled vacancies. This was the situation in Monocacy, Maryland, which would later become known as Graceham. A group of German settlers on their way to Virginia stopped. Impressed by the surrounding countryside, the German settlers decided to erect a church. This church would be a union of Lutheran and Reformed traditions. John Henry Herzer was sent from Bethlehem as a lay reader and school teacher for the United Lutheran Reformed congregation on the Monocacy after the death of its Lutheran minister. The congregation was familiar with Moravians because of their itinerant travels, when Moravians had stopped, preached, and offered services in the community. Similar stories could be told about the town of Lebanon or Hope. In the case of Emmaus and Lidditz, it would be Zinzendorf's preaching that would inspire local settlers to build a church, though not initially a Moravian church. From this case study and those that follow, we can see that Moravian town planning was not imposed ex nihilo, but emerged gradually from ecumenical encounters, pastoral necessity, and demographic needs. The model of development also explains the uneven and incremental nature of rural Moravian expansion. On his journey into the Pennsylvania backcountry, Zinzendorf preached at the home of Jacob Huber. Although George Klein, who was Huber's neighbor, did not hear Zinzendorf on that occasion, he later followed the Count to Lancaster, where he was captivated by Zinzendorf's charismatic preaching. In 1744, Klein permitted the construction of St. James Lutheran Church on his property. Lawrence Nyberg, an independent-minded Lutheran minister, further facilitated Moravian influence in the region. After Nyberg's suspension in 1746, he opened his pulpit to itinerant Moravian preachers before eventually joining the Moravian Church himself. By September 1746, discussions had begun regarding the construction of a Gemeinhaus, which would serve as both a community building and school. Completed 2 years later and overseen by Leonard Schnell, the Gemeinhaus became a center of Moravian religious life and supported a network of itinerant preaching. By 1749, the 11 members of the Warwick congregation, as they were known then, were formally received into the Moravian Church, and the congregation grew rapidly in the following years. In 1755, George Klein donated his entire 491-acre tract to the Moravians for the establishment of a formal settlement, or Gemeinort. The land was surveyed and laid out in 1757, and the community was named Lidditz, named after a castle in Coonwald associated with the flight of the ancient unity of the Brethren, following the execution of Jan Hus. The planning of Lidditz was profoundly shaped by the 1755 massacre of Moravians and indigenous converts at Gnadenhutten, and by the presence of refugee families who sought shelter with Klein. Rather than adopting the square town plan favored by mid-18th century settlements, Moravian leaders opted for a single street lined with homes. The church and community buildings occupied the center, with God's acre extending behind the church, divided by separate paths for men and women. Each house faced the street and included a walled courtyard, effectively creating an easily defensible enclosure with two controlled entrances. A new Gemeinhaus was completed in 1759, housed worship services until the construction of a dedicated church building in 1787. So, if you can see, these are facing the street side. And this would have been the only ways into or out of town was one long street. They would have had night guards on each of the streets. So now, so the development of Emmaus closely parallels that of Lidditz in its origins in the charismatic preaching and early influence of itinerant missionaries. Zinzendorf's preaching had reached two men, one Lutheran and one Reformed, who in 1742 petitioned the Moravians in Bethlehem for the establishment of a church. Land for the church was donated by Jacob Eberhardt, and a steady stream of Moravian itinerants supplied preaching and sacraments according to the Lutheran rite. Because the church building remained unfinished, Knaus's home served as the pulpit during Moravian's visit when he traversed the Pennsylvania backcountry. Plans for a school were underway by 1746, and during a stop en route to synod in Germantown, Bishop Spangenberg laid the cornerstone. In July 1747, the Moravian congregation was formally established, and the pastoral family of Anton and Elizabeth Wagner were sent to minister to the congregation and supervise the school. Pressure to complete a permanent church came not only from internal growth, but also from increasing competition with Lutheran and Reformed church leaders, such as Henry Muhlenberg and Michael Sattler, whose preaching and attacks on Moravians had taken root in the area. As with Lidditz, the 1755 massacre of Moravians at Gnadenhutten profoundly affected the Emmaus congregation. Rising fears of violence prompted Moravian leaders to remove students from the boarding schools in Nazareth and Emmaus and shelter them in Bethlehem. At the same time, Emmaus's growing commercial importance and the continued instability of the French and Indian War led leaders in Bethlehem to formalize the settlement as a Gemeinort. The town was surveyed by Kowalski. The Elders' Conference felt it best that, quote, that it be left to the Savior and to the brethren where the site shall be, end quote. Ultimately, God's voice through the lot, the new village followed the previously surveyed plan. While Emmaus's town has some parallels with Lidditz, that being a single main street bisecting 16 lots on each side, and a perpendicular street dividing the home sites into groups of 8, it diverged in other crucial respects. Rather than occupying the center of town, the church and God's acre were placed together on a large plot on the southeastern edge of the settlement. Situated along a well-traveled route, Emmaus regularly received visitors traveling to Bethlehem and beyond. Its design thus facilitated commercial traffic while insulating communal worship and education from the disruptions of this movement. So again, reflecting the Moravian willingness to adapt to planning without order. We turn to hope. Zinzendorf's goal of missionizing to the indigenous peoples required itinerant missionaries. On their trips along the Delaware, some of these missionaries would spend time with the Green family. Samuel Green and his wife Abigail became enamored with the Moravians and were baptized along with their children by Nathaniel Seidel and John Kammerhoff. After being baptized, the Green children entered the Moravian boarding school. Fear of attacks forced the Green family to move to Emmaus, where they grew even closer to the Moravians. In 1768, Samuel Green approached the Moravian leadership in Bethlehem and offered his entire property of roughly 1,000 acres to the church. Judging the gift excessive, Moravian leaders instead negotiated a purchase that reserved a farmhouse, garden, and livestock for the Green family. The sale price that the Moravians negotiated was roughly £1,000 sterling. Based on some rough calculations, that would equal about $218,260 today. Roughly $218 per acre. A bargain. The deal was finalized and signed by Seidel on March 7th, 1769, and marked the beginning of the Greenland experiment. Now, in contrast to other Moravian settlements, the first buildings were economic rather than ecclesial. Mills were constructed to ensure self-sufficiency, followed by farms to support the community's substance. Additional buildings included a tannery, a distillery, and an inn. All preceded the construction of a church. Worship services were presumably held in individual homes or the residence of Moravian clergy. Despite its small population, Moravian leadership in Bethlehem deemed the experiment successful and designated it a Gemeinort. Again, Johann Kowalski surveyed the town and together with Bishop Etwine and Seidel laid out its plan. By lot, the settlement was renamed Hope. And if you'll notice too, a lot of these settlements get renamed as they become Gemeinorts. What was once Warwick becomes Lidditz. What was once Greenland becomes Hope. Hope continued to expand over the following decades. In 1781, the cornerstone was laid for the community's first Gemeinhaus. Hope is a late 18th century Moravian settlement in which economic stability and human subsistence appear to take precedence over centralized worship. If Moravian towns are remembered as carefully ordered religious enclaves, I think these studies suggest a more complex reality. Taken together, the development of Graceham, Lidditz, Emmaus, and Hope demonstrate that Moravian town planning in 18th century America functioned less as the execution of a fixed theological blueprint than as a flexible practice shaped by pastoral necessity, frontier violence, economic demand, and ecumenical encounter. And interestingly, I chose this as a new slide to end with. Anyone unfamiliar, this is actually the plan for Salem. By lot, the congregation the lot said not to build where they originally planned. When they moved to where current Old Salem sits, this plan was no longer able to be fit because of the topography. So they altered the plan entirely. This plan is actually not quite to scale. It's an enormous plan. And there are some scholars that will argue that Zinzendorf rejected this plan because he didn't like the size. Moravians weren't prone to doing things large. I sort of reject that consensus, and it's more, I think, that because the lot moved where they just practically couldn't build it. So they're not opposed to changing those things. So even Reuter's plan for the ideal town includes notes on creating easily defensible community and orienting the town differently, giving regional considerations. There was one plan that was supposed to be built in the north. When they decided to build it in the south, they shifted the line based on where the sun rises and sets in the south. Local conditions and adaptations did not remove Moravian governance, which proved flexible enough to maintain a sense of community, appearance, and spiritual priority. I also have sought to challenge Elise Edwards' claim that buildings for private/personal use are the backdrop to larger iconic buildings. Moravian spirituality and placemaking, on the contrary, require us to give equal attention to houses, gardens, and cemeteries. An orderly divide between sacred institutions and secular realities crumbles under the weight of such an investigation. Moravian communities should not be seen as rigid spiritual impositions of religious ideas, but as disciplined, adaptive landscapes in which spiritual priorities were embedded within the ordinary structures of everyday life.
I think that was a good one to end on. Thank you, Josh. That was excellent. Thank you to all three of our speakers for the fantastic presentations tonight. We have time now for questions and answers. Before we get started, one came to my mind at the very first presentation tonight when Dr. Faull was discussing how these different emotions can be kind of mapped out or put into, I guess, I don't have the jargon, but can be like mapped out through different periods of time. I know that you provided everyone with a link to the methodology, but as an archivist, I was just really curious about how you, did you have a big body of sources that you pour into something that kind of allow you to generate emotions, or how do you do that?
What I did.
Okay, I was curious if you could say something more about how that happens.
Is there a mic here? Or is this one? Okay. So yes, if you go to my blog site, you'll see the methodology there. So I'll be quick though. So basically, as you can imagine, working with on this text, which is here in the Moravian archives, the original, what I did, because I had, of course, the German transcription, the English translation that I had made from the German transcription, and I know the text really, really well, because I translated it, is I chunked, this is the technical term, I chunked the text by author of the diary segment, and then I gave very strict instructions to an AI to create a tagged structured data sheet of emotions and people and dates and places. So I went chunk by chunk, so diarist by diarist, and this created a large database, which I was able to then apply the principles of sentiment analysis to. So tag by color, and then recreate that, and also by frequency, to recreate the Plutchek's wheel. And in other publications that I have done, and also with students that I worked with at my previous institution, we created an emotion wheel, for example, for the women's memoirs from Fulneck, Yorkshire, and looked at how those changed over time, and also in comparison with other collections. So it's a methodology that I've used before. I would say, if you're interested, I can ask you to go look at the methodology piece. Then also, as you know, I've also worked with GIS and mapping, and I've long been fascinated by creating a geography of emotions. What kind of emotions do people feel when they are in a certain space? And what's interesting is with the work I'm doing right now, obviously as a site manager here for the UNESCO World Heritage Site, that's something that we're working on with our NEH grant for our tour narrative, is how do we bring in this idea of emotion and place and music. So we're also working with Sarah Eierling on that as well. So that's how, it's a very, very brief kind of explanation of how I created that. So it was using this text, using both the German and the English, and checking the results against my own experience of having worked on this text for over 10 years. So.
That's super fascinating, and it's interesting too how your own expertise of what happened in the mission is important to have to weigh against the scientific data that you're also coming away with. We have a number of questions in the chat. I just want to ask one that came from Geneva, Switzerland. Reverend Dr. Winnell Curtin Roberts wrote to us. She did have to leave, but she had a question for Paul. The history of Herrnhaag is fascinating, Winnell said. Was it not like a Moravian nursery for missionaries at some point?
Yes, I mean all these places were nurseries for people to work in all kinds of Moravian professions. Missionaries, yes. Yes, many people left from there.
Okay. Does anyone in the audience have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question for Paul. In your presentation, there is an illustration that is showing a family looking up at, the Palace of Lights. I'm curious about that illustration. Do you know when it is from and what it is trying to depict? Is it like a romantic, just a romantic picture of an ideal Moravian family, or is it a particular person?
What you see is the Zinzendorf family standing in front of Ronneburg, that medieval castle where they were for a couple of years, also with their assistants. And the main person really is Anna Nitschmann. That's why Katie is smiling.
Yes.
Katie is working on a book on Anna Nitschmann. This is a scene so it's part of a larger image where you have scenes from the life of Anna Nitschmann, from her birth in Kunwald and her travel to America and her encounter with Zinzendorf in the forest here in Pennsylvania, but also this scene in front of the Ronneburg when Zinzendorf was expelled. So it's actually a really nice, it's a depiction of Anna Nitschmann life almost as a comic strip. It's her life in pictures.
I'm sorry, I can't resist. I have to say something. I love it's called a Sammelbild, and it was for Anna Nitschmann's 30th birthday. It was created for her. But what I love about that image is you have the big guy, right? You've got Zinzendorf, and then you've got a woman who is Erdmutter. No, I guess it is Erdmutter. And then the little figure is actually Anna Nitschmann. So this is the way in which the difference in age is depicted, that you have this perfect little human, just smaller, right? And so in that miniature, that collection of miniatures, you'll see this tiny little Anna Nitschmann all over the place until she sort of comes into her own and then becomes, the same size as everyone else. So it is, in a kind of weird way, the perfect Moravian family. We can talk about that another time.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience? I'll bring them.
Thank you. all the presentations were outstanding, and as I was listening, I was getting threads, commonalities. Could all three of you talk about the intersections that your research has made and how that has impacted moving forward into other research areas?
Not me first.
Okay, go on.
So Herrnhaag is really the backdrop of my study on this sifting time, this period when everything came to an explosion of emotions and theological ideas and everything. Herrnhaag is the backdrop of that, but also having grown up in the Moravian church in Europe, where we would go there for youth weekends and youth gatherings, and it was just a fascinating place for me as a young historian, but also a place where, you know, we would experience community and fellowship, and so that's really the backdrop of this.
So for me, those of you who know me know that I love water. I love kayaking. I like being out on the river. And I miss the Susquehanna River, I have to say. But the reason I was very interested, that I was fascinated by the pull of place is not only my own experience of place, and as I said in my paper, noticing these descriptions of landscape, which I found fascinating, but also I think my work with indigenous nations, with the Haudenosaunee. So when the Taradaho, the spiritual leader of the Haudenosaunee, came to this confluence, he stood with his back to the river with the Lenape faith keeper next to him. And it was the first time the two indigenous nations had been back to that place in official capacity since it was abandoned, I think, in 1755. And as he stood there speaking the words of thanksgiving in Onondaga, and it's going to sound crazy, but it's not, this bald eagle flew behind him against the bluff in the background and the water in front, and then the fish jumped out of the river. And he couldn't see this. I could, right? The audience could see this. And so after he finished, at the end of the ceremony, I told him this, and he just smiled. And he said, they're welcoming us back. And so that was this moment for me. And I've witnessed several moments like that with the Tuscarora as well, by Friedenshütten, which say, ask me to delve deeper. And yes, I use all of these fancy digital tools, but actually, thank you, Tom, for saying what you did. I do it not because I haven't, it's part of that hermeneutical process, right? That I have this intuition. I'm going to sound like Schleiermacher here. I have this intuition, and I need to test that against the evidence, and then I can always then go back in a circle to keep testing and to keep verifying what this intuition is. So that's really where that comes from for me.
So for me, I really wanted to go to a conference. The conference was on place. I said, what can I write about? And I picked this. But I think for me, one of the things that this is important for me because, again, I said living in Bethlehem, you hear all of these stories, and I think to some extent within the broader landscape of Moravian historiography, we tend to like to focus, and not without reason, on theology, on mission work, on a lot of these other things. And I think there is a practical element that we can look at that tells us a lot about the ways in which Moravian lives, and I think offers a broader contribution to American religious history more broadly that says, like, don't overlook us. There are things going on here too. And so for me, I think that's part the intervention I really want to make here is, like I said, there's a very small nod to her at the end, that there are a lot of American religious historians who foreground large church buildings and absolutely see everything else as secular and unimportant. that doesn't work when you study Moravian communities. And I think, again, bringing Moravians in and integrating that into the broader scheme makes a positive intervention in that particular way.
Thank you, Josh, for saying that. Again, in my present position as site manager for the UNESCO World Heritage Site, that is a conception of place that I am butting up against all the time. Right, this idea that somehow the secular building is completely separate but can be interpreted in a certain way versus the ecclesiastical building. And I think that I wish there were people that I work with every day who were here to hear you speak. I really, really loved your presentation. This is on Zoom.
And now that I have a microphone, I'm also going to add something, and that is, Josh mentioned a conference. So this was originally a panel that we presented at a conference in Chicago in January, a conference of the American Society for Church History. Josh was the one who had the idea for this panel, and Josh approached us and made suggestions, and he submitted this to the program committee, and it got accepted, and in very early week of the year in a very cold city of Chicago, we presented this. But we thought the people who really want to hear it are the people here in Bethlehem or the people online, so that's why we do a repeat today.
Thank you, Paul. We have another question that came. We have a lot of thank yous in the chat for excellent presentations. Some people had to go. They just want to express their thanks again. This question was for you, Paul. That someone asked if there's a relationship between the old Moravian buildings in Zeist and in the Netherlands and the place Herrnhaag that you spoke about. If there's a relationship between the buildings.
Well, the buildings in Zeist in the Netherlands are also large buildings and connected with each other. I think that is a communality. It's all built around a square. These are certain architectural principles that the Moravians had, also some principles that Josh dares to question if they were always applicable. But I think that's the common thread. But you know, the church space looks the same in Bethlehem and in Herrnhaag and in Herrnhut. So they're links on different levels.
And I think we have time for at least one more question from the audience. Yeah.
Thank you. Since the place in Bethlehem, there is, of course, a pronounced sense of place leading to the UNESCO designation. However, it's under assault, in my mind, with the city government, including the council and the zoning hearing board, who seem to be welcoming every developer who wants to build something and make money. The most recent case is this 7-story apartment building, which is going to overshadow Main Street and take away part of that sense of place. The city is under pressure as to whether or not it can retain its character. A friend of mine said, let Allentown be the Manhattan of the Lehigh Valley, and Bethlehem could be the Queens and Brooklyn. That's one way of putting it. But the threats are very strong and very real, because a lot of people want to come here, and they've got money. They're bringing, in some cases, large city salaries to a place which is less expensive. That's why rents and housing prices are going up so dramatically here. So I'm just trying to encourage all of us to do whatever we can. And is there anything going on that I don't know about to try to keep this in check? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Does anyone want to add? Or we can.
I can say something.
Sure.
I think it's
And
Faull.
we have time for. There were many
behooves
hands that
me
went
to
up,
say
so
something.
we have some time for more questions.
So thank you for your comment. I'm very aware of that sentiment. I work, as you know, a lot in City Hall with the mayor and also with his chief of staff and also with the economic development agency there within City Hall. As you know, our best bet of preserving a sense of place is the UNESCO World Heritage designation. And I think that that is something that we work very hard to make sure people understand, that the UNESCO designation isn't just a beautiful plaque on the wall outside Central Moravian Church, but rather it is something that I work towards every day in terms of protecting, conserving, and interpreting as well. The reason that a place is designated, whether it's a natural landscape or a cultural place, a reason that a place is designated after many years of process for a UNESCO nomination is because it needs to be protected. That was the very reason why UNESCO created this idea of a World Heritage List in the first place. And so I think not only the 10 acres of the World Heritage Site are protected, but if you look at any map, you will also see there is a buffer zone as well. And I think that anything that is proposed within that buffer zone and also within the site itself is under very, very close scrutiny for whether or not it will in some way impinge upon the integrity and the authenticity of the site. So I just want to assure you that the best protection for a sense of place, if you like, within the historic centre of Bethlehem is that UNESCO designation. And there's a whole bunch of people who are working very hard to make sure that that is protected.
Thank you, Katie. We have time for one last question. I saw some hands over here earlier. Yes, sir.
Well, let's go to death. Can we talk about God's acre?
Josh?
Yeah.
So I'm curious, not all of the diagrams show God's acre, and I'm curious how that shifted in the different compositions of the settlements.
It's a great question. So,
I think you need the microphone.
to the best of my knowledge, all of the sites that I shed have a God's acre. In the northern section of the Moravians in America, that begins to shift relatively early compared to the south. I did a paper before. In the south, that identity of having a God's acre is a post-World War II development that we don't see in the northern things take place. It's not the same sense of identity. Here in Bethlehem, once the God's acre approaches to be full, they open Niski Hill, you have a completely different kind of sense of feeling and relationship to the cemetery there as compared to other ones. And interestingly, in Emmaus too, you'll notice that God's acre doesn't have uniform headstones, as in other things.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a different relationship to Moravians and cemeteries as place. And again, and not all of them will be that have come later will even have them. So it's, I don't know, I haven't looked into the reason why, but that's kind of what we see.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Paul, for 3 excellent presentations. Thank you to our audience for coming here, both in person and online. Thank you for the slight technical difficulty that I probably caused, not our speakers. And thank you so much. If you're here with us in person, please stay for a little while. We're going to have light refreshments afterwards. There's some in our back gallery, so just join us back there. Keep an eye out for our next lectures. They'll be on our website. We'll post them, email blast, and make it also known on social media. But thank you so much again for coming.